Hello all, this is Cassie Powers with NASEO. Thanks to all for dialing in. We're going to wait just a moment to let folks join and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Cassie Powers with the National Association of State Energy Officials. Welcome to our webinar on the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook hosted by BCSE. We're going to get started. Just a couple of notes on housekeeping. I believe that all lines are currently on mute. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand at the webinar page, or you can type in a question into the chat box. You can also feel free to email me at cpowers@naseo.org with questions or comments. For the webinar today, we're going to hear from David Harry with the National Association of State Energy Officials, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists. David?
Thank you, Cassie, and thanks to everybody for joining today. We're very pleased to be able to co-host this webinar with the Business Council for Sustainable Energy on the Factbook. It's an amazing resource. I know likely many on the webinar may either be familiar with it or have heard of it or seen data before, and I think what's particularly beneficial is now, after a number of years of the data and analysis that comes together in this important publication, we can see trends and begin to even forecast and think about what it means going forward for state energy policy and programs and investments and private sector partnerships and so forth. I think the state and regional data, of course, is particularly useful from our perspective, and we're pleased everybody can join today. I also just want to take a moment to comment on the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. They've been an amazing partner for NASEO in a number of areas. We're pleased to do today's webinar, of course, but there are many other activities that we work on and partner on. And so thanks to Lisa Jacobson, Ruth, Laura, and the BCSE board for all of their help and support with NASEO and the State Energy Office priorities that often sync up with many of theirs. With that, I'll turn it over to Lisa and back to Kathy.
Thank you so much, David, and it really is a pleasure to join you, Cassie, and your members today. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy is in its 8th year of producing the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook, and the opportunities we get through NASEO to share this information with state energy office heads and their staff and others that they work with across their respective states is just so important to not only contributing to the findings that we're going to talk about today, but also, just being able to learn about what is working, where businesses can play a role, and what we can share with others that are looking to take on the challenges of policy for energy and the environment and resilience. So it's my pleasure today to share with you some of the top line findings of the 2020 Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. And then I'm pleased that we have 4 panelists with us, representatives of different industry sectors that will share their reactions to the data. And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. And then when we get to each one, of course, I will let you know who's speaking. But we're going to hear today, in addition to myself, from Justin Kosher, President of the Polyiso-Cyanide Insulation Manufacturers Association, Anna Pavlova, Vice President of Government Relations for Schneider Electric, John Sohn, Director of U.S. Government Relations for Capital Power, and Malcolm Wolf, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Hydropower Association. So it's really a great set of industry respondents here, and I look forward to hearing from them in a new way, how the state impact of the data that we're going to discuss is significant to their sectors. Just a tiny bit more background on the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. We were founded in the early 1990s by industry associations and companies in the energy efficiency, natural gas, and renewable energy sectors. And today, we represent companies and associations in those industries, but also in many more. Whether it be fuel cells or sustainable transportation or combined heat and power, or energy storage. There are such interconnections in the energy industry today, both with electricity, but also, as all of you know well, with transportation, buildings, and industrial and commercial activity. So we are all growing and integrating in new ways, and I think some of the Factbook data that I'll share with you just amplifies those trends. The BCSE, as David said, we have the privilege of working with NASEO and other partners on energy and appropriations and resilience policy here in Washington, but we also do educational work at the state and local level, and it centers around increasing the use of commercially available clean energy technologies, products, and services, support for affordable and reliable and resilient power systems, and reduced air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. The BCSE also has a small business arm, and this is relatively new for us, the Clean Energy Business Network, which some of your state's members may be familiar with, was started by Pew Charitable Trust in 2008, and we're now in the third year of having Clean Energy Business Network under our umbrella, and they represent small and medium-sized companies throughout the country and work to tell their story as well as to help them advocate and educate on policy issues. And when we release the Factbook each year, they release a separate compendium of faces behind the facts, so profiles of these energy entrepreneurs. So I encourage you to take a look at it, and obviously happy to make connections with any small businesses that might be part of Clean Energy Business Network that are in your state. The Factbook is produced by the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. We commission it from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, so they're the independent author, but we collaborate when needed on data and certainly appreciate the broad partnership that we have when we put the project together, and we couldn't do it without the supplemental support from a number of BCSE members and other partners. So I'm going to start my comments. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but I love this slide because it kind of gives you the quick headlines for the Factbook for this particular year. And we, as I mentioned before, we started the Factbook project about 8 years ago. And this year, what we wanted to do was do kind of a retrospective on the decade that we just ended across many of the benchmarks that we look at, as well as look at year-on-year trends. So this slide here kind of, again, gives you the headlines. The major metrics we look at, we call them through the bird's eye view section of the Factbook, speak to things like changes in our electricity mix, changes in our emissions, changes in a number of economic areas, and new opportunities. And clearly the activity of states, the activities of cities, and the activity of the private sector in and of itself has really provided opportunities for an empowered consumer. And that's another area that we kind of look at over the macro level. But across all those benchmarks, the 2010 trends have been very strong. And as you know, we have experienced a very rapid and significant transformation. We've seen our electricity mix transform in a relatively short time period. We've seen our emissions go down significantly. We've also seen our energy productivity increase. We've seen significant investment in clean energy industries, whether it be in the utility, electric, and natural gas side, whether it be ESPC investment or PACE investment, or investment in the sectors themselves, like renewable energy, or as BNEF calls it, energy smart technologies. We've seen our emissions drop, and when we looked at the last decade, we saw nearly a quarter on an economy-wide basis, so very significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we've seen many more choices for consumers. But at the same time, when we look at household spending on an average basis, we're pretty much at record lows for electricity, natural gas, and kind of all-in energy costs. So that's good news. And we want to understand both why that happened from the data and then how we can accelerate it. So looking at some of the charts a little bit more closely, I always start this presentation looking at our energy productivity and how we are doing over time with regard to growing our economy and how our energy consumption relates to that. And you could see that we have had strong energy productivity gains. These charts go back to 1990, but you'll also notice, and maybe for some of you that heard the Factbook presentation last year, 2018, was puzzling for us and concerning all at once. We saw a deviation from the long-term trend, but we were happy to see, even with healthy economic growth, we had been for a number of years hovering anywhere from 1 to 1.5 GDP growth per year. We were seeing energy productivities and gains in that time, but 2018, the economy kicked in and we were, above 3% GDP growth. And then we saw energy productivity decline. So there were other factors, but we were concerned. So we were pleased to see that we've returned to the long-term trend in 2019. And in terms of emissions, as I mentioned, we've had significant emissions reductions through the decade, and we've had significant emissions reductions in year on year. But what we've been focused most is on the right-hand side of this chart, which is really what's been happening in the different sectors. And transportation, for the third year in a row, is now the largest contributor to U.S. economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. So we really need to work on that. I mean, we need to work on everything, but that is certainly a major takeaway from this year's Factbook. When we think about economic development and economic competitiveness, it's a good story for the U.S. I mean, we are second to Canada in terms of low industrial power prices compared to other G7 countries, and that has enabled us, again, to have sustained economic growth and hopefully continued growth. And when we look at wholesale power prices and retail power prices, in most parts of the country, other than perhaps New England last year, we saw continued reductions. And overall, despite this massive change that we have had an opportunity to sustain low wholesale power prices and relatively stable retail power prices. And we know that much more than the fuel price goes into retail power prices. But a big question that we had at the beginning of the last decade was, okay, we'd like to see changes in our emissions profile and the carbon intensity of the power sector. That's just going to put prices through the roof. We have not seen that. And we look at the household level, this is what I spoke to before, we're basically at record lows since the records started in 1959 for the percentage of household spending that consumers are putting towards energy costs. And again, so this is a proportion, it's not absolute. But when you look at total energy expenditures, we're roughly about 4% of the average household costs for energy. So it's a really compelling and strong story. And again, energy expenditures on the left includes prices for gasoline. So let's look at the power sector for a few moments. You can see here these big changes. At the top on the left, you can see we went from 11% renewable energy generation to 18% at the end of 2019. You see right below it in the gray, natural gas, we went from about 24% to 38%. Nuclear has pretty much been steady state. But I would note when you look at the renewables and you look at the nuclear percentage, renewables is nearly on par with our nuclear fleet in terms of its significance. So it is a mainstream contributor to the power sector. And then obviously on the bottom, you see the decline in coal-fired generation. And more, when you look at what EIA is reporting in terms of the anticipated continued coal retirements, we still have some significant retirements ahead of us. And when you look at the right-hand side, the big story here is that our consumption, just as we saw in the energy productivity slide, is largely been flat. So we are becoming lower carbon. The carbon intensity of the power sector continues to decline significantly, but we still need to do much more. This is a new slide for the Factbook this year, and it looks at the slide we just saw and kind of puts it in a regional context. We did this because we wanted to better understand on a regional basis what the mix was and how the mix changed over time, as well as the volumes. So I think this slide, especially for those that aren't as familiar, really shows you a lot in terms of, which resources are being used where. And for federal policymakers, so clearly at the state and regional level, this matters too. Our hope is that they'll understand that, one-size-fits-all plans are challenging unless they are flexible and inclusive. So just to talk a little bit about energy efficiency, we had a tremendous amount of activity that really kicked in, around 2009 with, the Recovery Act. And then we had a lot of state leadership in a number of policy areas, and it was, very dramatic and very impactful. We're a bit concerned, and when we look at the investment figures, which I think I have a slide on in a moment, things have kind of leveled out. We need to dramatically accelerate our investment and our activity from a policy standpoint on energy efficiency. So that's another kind of significant takeaway that we've had both this year and probably the last couple of years. So here's the spending chart that I wanted to share with you. So, we continue to see significant utility energy efficiency spending, but, to meet the goals that many of your states are contemplating, either for energy efficiency purposes or for environmental purposes, we've got to do more on energy efficiency. So I included a few of the state slides that are of interest. We have a whole slide deck on the website that just pulls out the state data. But, we've been tracking corporate procurement of clean energy, and this is a chart that looks at a range of green tariff programs. And, we just started this chart, I think, last year, and it was, big jump from 1 year in terms of the types of initiatives that are out there, and, the map is filling in quick. Another note, related to renewable energy procurement is looking at by region what the competitiveness of these PPA prices are. So this chart, you're kind of breaking it out by region. The pink area is the power price range. And then, if you're above or below, you're either above, kind of the benchmark price range, or you're below it. And you can see, solar in many parts of the country is within that range. So is wind. And then there are places in particular for wind where it is below. So we continue to watch this area, and just note that in some parts of the country, obviously renewable energy can be some of the lowest cost options. And that's fueling, this empowered consumer, certainly on the corporate level, but I would say, at the household level too. But right now we're looking at corporate procurement of clean energy, and you're seeing corporate PPAs on the left. And we had a strong record-breaking year in 2019, 13.6 gigawatts of PPAs signed. And you can see the off-takers on the right-hand side. And yes, Google and some of the tech companies dominate, but we're noticing that it really is filtering throughout the economy, different types of players, and also with, even oil companies getting in the mix with some large activity. So just kind of wrapping up my comments with a few highlights. I mentioned at the beginning that transportation is really an area of focus, and the Factbook has a pretty extensive sustainable transportation section, so I encourage you to look at it. But here, just highlighting electric vehicle model availability, we're seeing the steady uptick. Again, we still have a long way to go, but, I think BNEF likes to note, just that there are many options now in these different classes, and, that is showing, and more, they often talk about what they anticipate for 2020 and the years preceding it, which will be even more options. So, the consumer experience and the opportunity to purchase sustainable transportation, is expanding, and, obviously we're going to need all options if we need to reduce our transportation emissions. So this is one of the new slides that we put in the fact book for 2020, and there's a new section, and there's two new sections related to this. One, there's a slide in their section on hydrogen, and then there's a section on renewable natural gas. This is of interest to us, obviously from a transportation point of view, but increasingly on an industrial and buildings heat perspective. This here is showing you some of the players in the RNG value chain, and RNG again is renewable natural gas. And a number of our members are involved both in transportation and increasingly in heat. So we're watching this very closely to see, what the growth trajectory is. And, really this was a, really just beginning conversation 2 or 3 years ago. And in the last 12 to 18 months, it's really been a primary focus for a number of our utility and non-utility members. So, I'm going to stop my comments here, and I'm going to transition to hearing from some of our panelists. So I'd first like to introduce Justin Kosher, again, president of the Polyiso-Cyanurate Insulation Manufacturers Association. Justin, please take a couple moments and reintroduce yourself to the group, because I know you work closely with NASEO. And then, we have a few slides queued up that you wanted to share. So I really appreciate you taking some time and sharing your reactions to the Factbook data with this group.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to NASEO for hosting today's webinar. For those of you who don't know who PIMA is, we are an Arlington, Virginia-based trade association and represent North American manufacturers of polyiso-cyanurate or polyiso insulation. Our products are used in commercial and residential building, most commonly found in commercial roofs, and our manufacturers operate 30 manufacturing facilities across the U.S. And so, of course, a lot of the policies and facts that are captured in the fact book are of interest to our members. I'm going to touch on 2 or 3 slides from the energy efficiency section of the fact book, and in particular, slides that deal with building energy efficiency. And so, Lisa, if you can go to the next slide. This slide highlights another report that many of you may be familiar with, an annual scorecard produced by ACEEE. The scorecard ranks states on 33 different metrics that are grouped in the 6 policy areas. You can see the 6 policy areas listed on the left-hand side of the slide. This annual report, and the one that was issued last year is the 13th annual report, provides a lot of good insight into how the states stack up against one another in terms of their policies and where the emphasis within the different policies are for each individual states. As you look at the rankings that are listed along the bottom, it's sort of interesting to go back to the slide that Lisa showed earlier that shows the regional mix and volume. And in a lot of those areas that had lower volumes, you tend to see those states that come from those regions rank higher on this scorecard. But as you see on the bottom there, the top 3 for the last year were Massachusetts, California, and Rhode Island. Important for PIMA, building policies are one of the 6 key areas. They account for 8 points out of the total 50. As the next slide will go into, building energy code adoption and compliance are key metrics that the scorecard uses to measure and score the state's respective performances. And so on this slide, I think this was a slide we added to the 2018 fact book, we're trying to capture trends at the state and in some cases the local level with building energy efficiency policies. As folks on the phone know, building energy codes are probably the most significant policy in terms of attacking that low-hanging fruit when it comes to efficiency improvements in our built environment. As you all know, ICC and ASHRAE are two of the well-known organizations that promulgate consensus-based codes and standards for both new construction and existing buildings. This slide here is written in terms of the IECC for comparison purposes. And what we've seen since we began compiling this data is over a relatively short period of time, and you'll see on the slide there, just looking from 2018 to 2019, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of states and consequentially the number of the percentage of population covered by what I sometimes refer to as modern energy codes. So those would be the most recent versions of the IECC, 2015 and 2018. And you'll see that 69% of the population resides in an area that has a modern energy code applicable to residential buildings, and 74% lives in a jurisdiction that has an applicable modern building energy code for commercial buildings. And compare that to just 46% of the population in 2018 shows sort of the rapid adoption that we are seeing in states when it comes to evolving and keeping current their building energy code policies. But the slide also speaks to some of the work that's left to be done. You'll see the final bullet point there. 16% of the U.S. population lives in an area that has a 2009 or earlier or no energy code at all. We do account for the states that do not have statewide energy codes. Colorado is a good example of a state that has no statewide energy code, but a number of the jurisdictions within Colorado, including the major jurisdictions, have adopted the modern energy codes. And then another note here is that ICC is, and we just wrapped up last year, work on the 2021 IECC, which even represents more cost-effective energy efficiency gains compared to the 2015 and 2018. And so we hope that in the next year's time or in 2 years' time, this map will continue to show that states that have committed to modernizing their energy code policies on a regular basis continue to adopt these codes that drive more cost-effective energy savings for both new and existing construction. And on the next slide, Lisa, I'm going to use this to transition to one of my co-panelists. And while energy codes, I think sometimes can be misconstrued as new construction only policies, when they in fact have an entire chapter dedicated to existing buildings, other policies have emerged and come onto the scene that use transparency, information, and market forces to generate improvements in the energy efficiency of our existing building stock. And I believe my co-panelist, Anna, wants to start her remarks with some other observations on this slide. So Lisa, I will go back on mute and wait for the questions from the audience.
Yes, Anna, I'm just going to introduce you again, and then I can go back to that slide if you want me to.
Sure,
so,
thank you.
We're going to hear from Anna Pavlova. She's Vice President of Government Relations for Schneider Electric. Do you want to say a couple words about Schneider Electric, and then I can go back to the slide? You just cue me.
Yeah, that's fine. Hi, everybody. I was a co-chair of the affiliates program at NASEO for 3 years, and so I really appreciate NASEO and the tremendous amount of work that they do, and also the challenge that you all have in states, especially given all the energy transitions and all the pressures that you have daily. So I'm really excited to be invited as a panelist. And Schneider Electric is really focused on energy management, process automation, and resilience. So our products are in about 70% of world's buildings, 45% of US hospitals. A lot of it is electrical equipment and energy management solutions, and as well as industrial automation and process improvement products in industrial facilities. And we also have a relatively new program on resilience around microgrids, and I'll briefly touch on that. So Lisa, if we can just go back to that slide, I want to go back to your point, Lisa, when you said that energy efficiency, we have a lot more work to do in that space. That's true, and I think the good news here, and from this chart, is quite a few cities, as you can see, are doing energy benchmarking. And energy benchmarking is really the first step towards understanding what the energy needs are in buildings in order to be able to do something about that. The good news is that we're seeing a couple of states, like Colorado, for example, who are interested in statewide benchmarking for larger commercial buildings. We very much support that, primarily because it's the kind of access to data and information that we need in order to recommend what kind of energy improvements and energy efficiency the building might need. So we're looking forward to seeing that list expand, and it's pretty good so far. So if maybe we can go to my next slide. Thank you. And so I think in relation to that, the other good news in my mind is this very rapid organization in states around decarbonization policies. So I see states writing some kind of plans around whether it's decarbonize their economy by 2050, by 2030, a lot of city activity as well. And that's great. It gives us a lot of opportunity to introduce or maybe reintroduce energy efficiency, maybe reinvigorate it a little bit, to say it's not just the building envelope, but it's active energy management, as well as new and better, more green construction materials, better building codes, as we've mentioned. So this trend, the subnational action to address climate change is really taken off and is very important, as you all know, because you're part of that. And I think obviously in the vacuum that the Congress has left by not acting very much on it, we believe that the states are going to lead the way here. And there is a statistic that about 60% of the US population are now under some kind of a plan or planning process for decarbonization by their state. So that's a significant number. And so we hope to see that these plans really consider not just the kind of existing policies and maybe jumping to, okay, let's just ban gas. Sometimes that's like the thing that people think that will solve all the problems. I think there are a lot of other things one could do, like benchmarking, like understanding your carbon intensity in addition to your energy intensity, as well as how can buildings be optimized and continuously managing the grid. Can the building contribute to managing the grid? So lots of opportunity there, and certainly we're happy to chat with any state that wants to discuss that topic. And I think I have one more slide on a slightly kind of a side topic here in terms of resilience, but I think a very important one. We often, I think, kind of see the emergency management state officials focused on resilience, but then everybody else focused on energy transition and decarbonization. I would argue that they are somewhat linked, because what we're seeing in this graph or in this map is that microgrids really have a pretty good penetration level in the US. But more importantly, we're not talking about diesel generators, backup generators here. We're talking about distributed energy on site. And what's even more interesting is because there's distributed energy on site, it's not just for emergency. It's a system that can manage the building's energy um, any day, every day. So in projects that we do, the system allows to purchase energy at the lowest price from the main grid and sell at the highest. So the facilities actually constantly uh, manipulated by this distributed energy resource. So resilience fits right into decarbonization. It fits right into energy efficiency with these microgrid technologies. So I think my overarching point is don't think of it as a bunch of backup generators that can't do much except to turn on during an emergency. And do think how microgrids and distributed energy resources on site of critical facilities can both deliver resilience and deliver decarbonization. And so we see quite a bit of that happening in the US, and I tell you, it's going to grow really fast. Just from Schneider's perspective, our microgrid business is 4 years old. I've been in the company for 5. I remember when we first started the conversation, and now it's exploded, and there's so much demand for more of these because it really just is so much more than simple backup power that only lasts a couple hours, and then in a major disaster you don't have a solution. So this is a trend to watch and to grow and to also consider, I think, as part of your decarbonization plans. So thank you. That's all I wanted to cover.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to go next to John Sohn. John is the Director of U.S. Government Relations for Capital Power. John, thanks for being with us today. I'm going to turn it to you now to share some of your comments and some of the slides that were noteworthy in the 2020 edition.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Capital Power, we are a growth-oriented North American power producer, publicly traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange and headquartered in Edmonton, Alberta, and with a U.S. headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. We develop, acquire, own, and operate power generation facilities using a variety of clean energy sources. Currently, we have about 6,200 megawatts of power generation at 26 facilities in the U.S. and Canada. Excuse me. And our core strategy focuses on renewable energy, primarily wind, solar, and biomass, as well as natural gas. I'm a DC policy wonk-based person, so I'm going to focus on 3 key policy areas that have that are identified in the fact book that have helped grow our renewables portfolio in the U.S., which has been primarily wind to date with some solar and biomass. And so the 3 areas I was going to focus on are state clean energy mandates, federal tax credits, and a bit more on corporate procurement that Lisa mentioned earlier. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is the state clean energy mandates or renewable goals, usually known as portfolio standards, renewable portfolio standards, or RPS, which, as most of the people on this phone know well, are state level policies that require electric utilities to gradually increase the amount of renewable energy that they deliver to their customers. In our view, the most effective RPS designs, which do vary from state to state, don't handpick a specific renewable technology. Rather, all renewables are able to compete, incentivizing cost reductions and efficiency gains. However, we have seen some carve-outs to boost emerging technologies or certain kinds of exclusions of technologies based on local environmental or political concerns. RPS policies also tend to encourage the growth of additional homegrown in-state electricity increasingly as compared to out-of-state resources, with a view to spurring the most direct local economic benefits. Today, about 29 states plus Washington, D.C. have RPS policies in place. The most aggressive policies are in Washington, D.C. and Hawaii, which respectively have 100% renewable energy targets in law. Likewise, another trend in this space we're seeing is a number of states, most recently the state of Washington, moving towards 100% clean standards, which are somewhat distinguished from renewable energy standards in that they keep the door open as we get closer and closer to net zero carbon policies, and they try to keep the window open for emerging technologies like carbon capture and other ways to keep traditional baseload energy resources viable that can prove a low carbon threshold. On the next slide, I'm going to touch on federal tax credits. Federally, these have really been the key driver for renewables growth over the time frame that Bloomberg and the Business Council have been doing this Factbook in particular. The growth has been for wind, primarily from the production tax credit, and solar, the investment tax credit. This slide shows the credits cost to Treasury peaking and beginning to go down as they are phased out, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Just as tax treatment for other energy resources has enabled growth and development, the PTC and ITC respectively have helped renewable developers access the capital we need to invest in and build new projects. The PTC for wind has been a real success for us in that it enables tax equity hungry investors to crowd private capital into the equation, and has helped establish a US manufacturing base at the same time, which has driven the cost of wind down overall by about 69% over the last decade, according to the American Wind Energy Association. Investing in US wind farms enabled by the PTC has spurred over $143 billion in private investment in the US economy over the last 10 years. And likewise, the solar ITC is setting the solar industry for continued growth in the coming years. However, we are seeing phase outs, as you may know, of both the PTC and ITC as the debate over whether they are quote unquote subsidies versus compared to what other technologies receive or are mature renewable industries now. So new policy ideas we think will emerge in the coming years around technology neutral clean energy tax incentives or tax credits for things like energy storage as Congress continues to debate these ideas. Lastly, I just wanted to come back to the idea of, on the last slide, of corporate clean energy procurement, which has been a key driver in the renewable sector as well from a policy perspective. And while neither specific state or federal action, they really are a reaction by corporations to shareholder demand and customers and the jurisdictions in which they operate for cleaner and cleaner energy. So now over 100 companies, including companies like Walmart, Anheuser-Busch, General Motors, et cetera, have committed to 100% renewable energy targets or other similar goals. Google has already achieved its 100% renewable energy goal with 95% of their electricity coming from wind, for example. In Capital Power's own experience, these corporate procurement goals have been crucial. In our facility, our Bloom facility in Kansas, we had a financing package that involved Allianz, who enabled our project through a 10-year fixed price contract covering 100% of our project's output. And then under the terms of the contract, Capital Power swapped the immediate market revenue from the project's generation for a fixed annual payment for a 10-year term. And I'm saying all that because in the end that attracted Microsoft to the deal. They saw enough project certainty from that deal to purchase the renewable energy credits from the project to help meet their own corporate clean energy goals. And the project subsequently won a Deal of the Year award. So it's these sorts of stories that are happening all over the place in the renewable energy industry because of these corporate goals. Lastly, one other trend I wanted to mention that's particularly relevant to state energy officials is the trend of businesses choosing to specifically locate new facilities where they can be directly powered by renewables, thinking about Facebook in New Mexico and Apple's, some of Apple's new centers in Iowa, and Amazon looking at opportunities in Oregon, and economic incentives for this pairing of renewables and new data centers is going to be a key and increasing trend going forward. So Lisa, I'll turn it back to you there, and thank you again.
Thank you, John. And next, we're going to hear from Malcolm Wolf, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Hydropower Association. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Great to have a chance to talk to all my friends at NASEO again. As a former state energy official and NASEO chair, kind of my hat's off to all of you for all the great work that you're doing. And you know that you guys are at the cutting edge of energy policy. That's actually where it happens. So Lisa, I've only got 2 slides. Why don't I jump to them? This first shows the deployment of U.S. hydropower. The key takeaway here, I guess I've got 3 points I want to highlight for you. First is that there's about 103 gigawatts of generation of carbon-free hydropower currently on the grid, about 80 gigawatts of traditional hydro, and about 23 gigawatts of pumped storage. So together it's over 100 gigawatts of carbon-free power on the grid. Equally important, we think it's really a force multiplier that having this kind of flexible resource on the grid enables more wind and solar and other variable resources to get integrated onto the grid. If there's a cloud bank over Phoenix, you can kind of instantly release more of reservoir hydro or pumped storage and accommodate that and then cycle it back down. It's also long duration storage. So I think it's like 93%, 95% of all storage is actually pumped storage. And while I'm a huge fan of batteries, we shouldn't ignore long duration storage as well. I've started talking about hydro as the yoga of the grid, because it's a flexible resource that we can use to keep the rest of the grid balanced. My final thought on this slide is really that second chart about new hydro capacity licensed or exempted by FERC. The key takeaway there is that hydro is not tapped out. And I didn't realize this until I started looking at NHA. Only 3% of US dams, of existing dams, have generation. So let me repeat that. 97% of existing dams do not have generation. So we built the dams for flood control, for irrigation, for recreation, for water storage, for a variety of reasons. And typically we then added, to the 3% that do have power, we just added it to defray the costs of building the reservoir. So if we can tap into that 97% of existing facilities that don't have generation, we could significantly increase hydro without any new dams. In fact, DOE issued a report a few years ago finding the potential of 50 gigawatts of new potential without new dams. And so that second chart there shows the kind of the pipeline of capacity that's available within the existing system. But the reality is most of that hasn't been built, most of that won't be built. And that's a concern that we get to a little bit on this next slide. So moving along, thanks, Lisa. This is the pipeline for licensing and relicensing of hydro plants going forward. And the key takeaway here is that 30% of the existing fleet is going to need relicensing by 2030. So I'll confess, when I was working in Maryland, I never even toured the Conowingo facility that provided 10% of our power, because there were no regulatory issues. It operated, it was great. We're now entering a season that a third of the existing fleet is up for relicensing. So you can't ignore or take for granted your hydro any longer. Relicensing on paper takes at least 5.5 years if you go through the process in an orderly manner. However, most facilities take more like 7 to 12 years, and there are many facilities where it's 15 or 20 years. I actually just was on a panel with Stephen Wright, who used to head Bonneville Power Authority, and he said that during his career, he's licensed or relicensed a nuclear plant and a hydro plant. And it was faster, cheaper, and easier to relicense a nuclear plant than a hydro plant. So if we're going to get the third of our existing fleet relicensed, we've got some challenges. Two final takeaways from me, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A period. As you're thinking about your planning, as you're thinking about whether it's deep decarbonization in a clean energy standard or reliability and resiliency, I encourage you as a state energy official to push your staffs, to push the commission, to push the utilities, to go beyond megawatts and megawatt hours. When I was in your seat, that's all I had to do was think about megawatts and megawatt hours. But as we're going into an era where renewables are increasingly displacing coal, they're displacing gas, suddenly all those resources that we used to lump together as ancillary services and didn't really matter because we had tons of, suddenly they're going to become really important. We're not going to have spinning reserves. We're not going to have black start, inertia, all of those things without kind of the existing infrastructure of spinning generation like coal and nuclear and natural gas. It becomes more important. So as you're thinking about your plans, you can't just think about megawatts and megawatt hours. My final thought for the states part of the wave that are looking at clean energy standards, whether it's the 8 states that have enacted them or the dozen or more who are currently considering them, I encourage you to think about your goal. If the goal of the state is carbon-free generation, then you need to think about both new generation and existing carbon-free generation. You can't simply take a 25% RPS and make it a 50% RPS because unlike what Justin said, kind of friendly amendment, most state RPSs do not include existing clean energy generation because they were intended to promote new generation. Well, if your goal is carbon-free, then the difference between new and existing no longer matters. It mattered in the 90s when a lot of these RPS bills were enacted, but it doesn't matter now. So I encourage you to, if you're in a state thinking about a clean energy standard, to include all carbon-free resources, including new and existing. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Lisa, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to everybody. Really great comments. You know, we have a few minutes left. I have some questions from the moderator role, but I'd like Cassie to turn it over to you and see if we have any questions from our audience.
Thank you, Lisa. I am looking through the chat and questions right now and do not see any. As a reminder to folks on the phone, you can use the raise your hand or you can insert questions in the chat or the questions tab. You can also feel free to email me at cpowers@naseo.org. So I don't see any right now. Okay, well, I will ask one of my first questions, and it kind of picks up on a number of comments that folks made, but I'm going to ask for a little bit more information. So when you're looking out over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years, what are the emerging issues that you are watching? And to the extent that they involve state leadership, focus on those perhaps first. And Malcolm, you were just making some comments that related to some of that, but I might go back to you first. Just to kind of get us started, because you were kind of heading in that direction.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. I do see kind of the transformation of the energy system that you highlight in the fact book. The last decade, I think we're going to see that continuing, and I do think it creates a whole different set of challenges. We didn't really have to worry about reliability and resiliency in quite the same way when renewables were, less than 20% of the grid. But if you're talking about offshore wind or gigawatts of renewables, suddenly you've got ramping issues and grid resiliency issues on the gigawatt scale. And so I guess I encourage state energy officials to think about that. Already California's dealing with gigawatts of ramping, as the sun sets every night, suddenly they've got to add gigawatts on a regular basis. The wildfires also taught them that they need not only short duration, but long duration. So figuring out the reliability and resiliency on a grid that is deeply decarbonized, which means more variable, is one issue. And the second issue is thinking through clean energy standards so that they can be done in an affordable way, which we think means kind of you have to allow for innovation by allowing all technologies, all carbon-free technologies to compete. Let me stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you, Malcolm. John, can I go to you next, and I'll then go to Anna and Justin, please. So John, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, I touched on this a little bit, but one of the more interesting trends is a number of states now, and I think increasingly corporations looking at 100% clean versus 100% renewables, and there's sort of an ongoing debate about whether one approach is better than the other from a cost perspective and a carbon reduction perspective. And I think that debate will continue to play out at the state level, and the role of what, and sort of a separate issue around increasingly states looking at targets for energy storage technology. We're seeing a few states like New York and others step into that space. I think that's going to be a growing area going forward as well.
Thanks, John. Anna, I'd love to hear from you.
Lisa, you cut out when my phone cut out. So are you asking about trends?
Yeah, what are you watching, and especially things that are of interest to states?
Right. So we're watching infrastructure and the role of electrification and infrastructure as well. So think about ports, airports, big, anything. We don't really do work around highways, so anything that's not a highway, and how electrification and process improvement and automation can both lead to energy savings, to lower emissions. We also are working to tackle the workforce development issues because, frankly, that's key for us to be able to retrain. We now, any infrastructure project that we go into, we need to provide a training program for the workers. So it's not just automation and people don't have a job. And so we're now thinking about that trend and how does the workforce training and redevelopment going to mesh with the decarbonization trend.
Yes, very interesting, and thanks for raising some of those topics. And Justin, love to hear your thoughts.
I'm glad Anna brought up the workforce issues. I think that's a big non-energy that will really dictate some of the continued success demonstrated in the Factbook. And then just to add to the other panelists' comments, I think one thing we're seeing is over the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of state-led action by groups like the U.S. Climate Alliance. And so perhaps one trend we're looking is to see if that trend expands beyond the coastal states and we start to see more of the middle of the country and leaders in the middle of the country join with their colleagues on the east and west coast in pursuing those state-led initiatives in the face of maybe less federal action.
Thank you very much. Cassie, I know we have 2 minutes left. Is there a quick question from the audience, or we could close, or I could do one rapid fire question?
Yes, we do have a question from state of Minnesota. Is BCSE issuing a state-by-state fact sheet for this year? And if so, when will those be available?
Oh, thank you. Good question. We are working on the Minnesota State Energy Fact Sheet as we speak. We initially were thinking it would be released the week of March 16th. And, I think that's probably still on track. And then just for all other states, a spin-off of the Factbook, I mentioned that on our Factbook website, which you can see the URL to the BCSE website here, you just click right into the Factbook. It's segmented out in many ways, including a whole infrastructure deck and then a state and regional deck. But then we also developed 50 state short form fact sheets with about 10 data sets that we get from the Factbook. So every state is covered in those fact sheets. and we will probably have those more like April timeframe. So stay tuned. Minnesota's state energy fact sheet is on the way.
Great, thank you. And we are at time. And Lisa, I'm just wondering if you have a couple of words for closing up.
Well, I just, again, want to thank NASEO and all of you who are calling in, for your interest in this work. And it is an evolving process. And when we've met with you in the past and you've said, hey, it would be great if we could look at X and Y, we really do try to build, those new data sets into the Factbook each year. There are, as I mentioned, a number of new areas. Malcolm's slide on hydro relicensing is one of them. We also, as I mentioned, have, and I think Anna showed a slide that's new on microgrids. We also have some new data on digitalization, and I mentioned hydrogen and renewable natural gas. So every year we're trying to improve what we're putting forward, and we benefit from your advice and hope it's helpful to you. So we are happy to engage one-on-one with any NASEO member or affiliate on this material. We are happy to present it to your colleagues at the state and local level. And obviously the webinar format is terrific because we can record it or we can do it live. So your colleagues don't have to feel that time pressure of scheduling. There's a lot of flexibility with this format, and we could cater it to your particular interests. So thank you, and look forward to continued opportunities to work together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And David, if you're still online, if you'd like to offer a closing word. Oh, and I see that he might have signed out. So in that case, I just want to say thank you to Lisa as well as to all of our speakers for joining us, and to all of the states and affiliates on the line. This has been most informative. There will be a recording of the webinar available online afterwards. And if you have any types of questions, please feel free to email me and I can pass them along to our panelists. Thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you.